Okay, in this webcast I'm going to go through the answers to question 1 from the recent test. So question 1 was on evolution, and the first question was explain how each of the following provides evidence that evolution occurs. So you were asked to, for 6 marks, explain how the fossil record provides evidence that evolution occurs, how molecular biology provides evidence that evolution occurs, and how comparative anatomy provides evidence that evolution occurs. Okay, so to answer this question well, you really need to explain the bit about how it provides evidence and understand what is meant by evolution. So some people most people did reasonably well on this, but there's a tendency just to sort of say why the fossil record was important and what it tells us. But really you want to explain how the fossil record provides evidence that we see change in species over time. So remember at the beginning of the course we defined evolution as being a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. Well, that will be what you would see on the small scale. So if we're looking at experiments and carrying out experiments during our lifetime and sampling populations over time, yeah, we're looking at changes in populations over periods of time. But when we're talking about evolution on a large scale, i.e. macroevolution, what we're really looking at is changes in species. So remember the theory of evolution is put forward by Darwin, and in the first tenet he proposed that evolution occurs, that changes happened over time, and he proposed that this has happened gradually, and then he talked about the process of speciation, whereby we get lineages that split into different species over periods of time. And he therefore said that if we take all existing species today, say this species, and this species, we can, and these over here, we can trace them all backwards to a point at which they all shared a common ancestor in the evolutionary past, which in the case of this tree I've just drawn is in this red position here. So what Darwin was talking about was the process of descent with modification. So this idea that we're all descended from a common ancestor that lived a certain length of time ago in the past, and that through time what we've seen is descent, that is ancestry, but with changes. So changes that have been fixed by natural selection or have come about randomly by genetic drift. And over time these changes have led to splitting of lineages into what we see now as different species. There will be of course other species on this tree that we no longer see because they've gone extinct. What we simply see today is what has survived to the present time. Okay, so having said all of that, let's just go back and figure out an answer to this question. So how does the fossil record provide evidence that evolution occurs? Well, in the fossil record, because we can date fossils and order them according to how deep they are in rock layers by dating the rocks, the layers of rocks around the fossils or above or below the fossils, we can estimate the age, and what we can get is a sequence of forms through time. Okay, and this sequence of forms through time allows us to see transitional forms, sometimes referred to as missing links. So transitions between more modern day species and ancestors. So for example, with the evolution of whales, if we order the fossils through the fossil record, we can see, tracing back through time, we can see how whales evolved from creatures that were once land-dwelling, that had 4 limbs, so they were tetrapods, and sequencing ordering the fossils through time, we can see that whales went through a process whereby these hind limbs were lost and the front limbs were modified through time to form flippers. Okay, so which are now used for stability. So we can see transitional forms, we can order things through time, and what is also important about the fossil record is that we see that ancestral species, so that those that lived in the past that we find in the fossil record tend to resemble in some way modern species in the same location. So for example, in South America, when Darwin was travelling there in the 1830s, he found fossils of giant creatures, things that resembled modern day armadillos found in the same place, except all extremely giant forms of them. And so by ordering these fossils and by comparing ancestral forms with those that we see today in the same location, we can support the hypothesis, the theory that species have changed through time, and that the changes happen by gradual modification of pre-existing forms until what we see today is those that have survived throughout this length of time. And we can trace these back, and we can see similarities perhaps in the body plan or structure or adaptations of modern species and ancestral forms. Okay, molecular biology. Well, it's a similar sort of thing. So with molecular biology, what we're looking at is DNA sequences. So instead of comparing fossils and ordering these through history, what we can do is we can sequence existing species. So existing species can be sequenced. Sometimes we can also sequence ancient species as well. It just depends how well preserved and whether there's still the possibility of extracting DNA from some of the bone marrow, etc. It's often not possible, but sometimes it is. But even if we can't do that, what we can do is sequence species today, and what we see is the more similar two species are, the more similar their DNA sequences. Okay, so two species that are closely related share a large degree of DNA sequence identity, and those that are more distantly related, and we usually see this through quite different morphology. The morphological differences are usually matched by DNA differences, but even with very distantly related species, that might be more difficult to link together by looking at their morphology and anatomy. But if we look at their DNA, we see that these distantly related species also share sequence similarity. And the important thing about this is that the degree of sequence similarity is unlikely to have come about by chance, because there is, even between species that we consider to be quite different, there's still a large number of genes that are conserved, and we can clearly see their relationships when we look at the DNA sequence. And so this argues for descent with modification, i.e. that we descend from a common ancestor that lived a long period of time ago, and through time we've seen changes in the form of mutations that have made different species, different lineages more and more different to each other, The more different, the longer ago they shared a common ancestor, the more similar the DNA sequences, the more recently they shared a common ancestor. And it's not just the sequence of the DNA, it's also the order of genes on chromosomes, and even the structures of chromosomes and which genes are on which chromosomes, which tend to be conserved between even quite distantly related species, arguing that these similarities didn't come about just by chance, that they came about because these two species both derived from a shared common ancestor that had a ancestral DNA sequence that has to some extent been conserved through time as it was passed down from parent to offspring to offspring to offspring, etc. Okay, now let's just have a look at the last one, comparative anatomy. So comparative anatomy, as the name suggests, is comparing body plans, e.g. perhaps bone structures and things like that. And very similarly to the molecular biology, instead of looking at DNA, we're looking at body plans and other morphological structures. We see that closely related species have similar body plans, and this argues that the body plans that we see have derived from an ancestral body plan, and that this body plan, the ancestral body plan, has been modified gradually through time. So I'll just write this at the top. So an example of this would be comparing the forelimbs of all tetrapods. Well, even you can even go further than tetrapods. But let's say just looking at tetrapods, we can compare the forelimbs, and we see that things like cats and dogs and even people, we have very similar bone structures in our forelimbs. Our arms can be shown to be homologous to the front limbs of the front walking limbs of cats and dogs and things like that. Then if we look at more distant species going outside of tetrapods, we see the bone structure conserved in the flippers of penguins, the wings of birds, the actual bone part of the wing rather than the feathers. And the best way to explain this is that all of these anatomical features have derived from a single ancestral form, that an ancestor that we all share in common, that lived maybe a few 100,000 years ago, or probably a bit longer than that, a few million years ago, and that through time the evolution has worked upon this body plan, making small changes here and there to adapt species to different environments. As the species separate and become adapted to different environments, the body plans are modified further, and as time goes by they get progressively more and more different from each other, but we can still see the basic plan that is shared between all of them. Okay, so the second part of question 1 was all about this, explaining this diagram. So this diagram is all about genetic bottlenecks and how this affects animal populations. So a bottleneck is a particular type of genetic drift. And what happens in a bottleneck is when some sort of catastrophic event kills off a large proportion of the population. Okay, so it could be non-random, but we typically tend to think of these catastrophes as being perhaps a climate change or a fire or some sort of drastic event that sort of randomly kills off the majority of your population. So if the population is killed off randomly, it's as if we're passing all of these balls in this bottle through a bottleneck and taking just a random sample of what comes out. And if we look at the colours in the surviving population, you see that they don't really resemble the original population very much at all. So in the original population we had quite a lot of whites, perhaps just a little fewer blacks, and a very small number of greys. In the surviving population you can see we've got predominantly blacks, only one white ball, and the grey one has been lost. So typically we end up with a different genetic composition in the new population to what was in the original population. Okay, so typically what